Now it is my pleasure to introduce our panel on addressing environmental stress and trauma, social emotional strategies that promote healthy schools. Some of you may be wondering why we settled on this topic, so I want to tell you a little bit about that. Earlier this year, we came across a disturbing statistic. Across the nation, 51% of students attending public schools are from low-income backgrounds. 51%. This is the highest level since the National Center for Education Statistics began tracking this figure. Then we asked ourselves, why is no one talking about this? If this really isn't a crisis, then what is? So we decided it was important to talk about it together. It's an unfortunate fact that poverty is on the rise, as are inequity, class disparities, and racial and income inequality. Students living in high poverty communities like Bridgeport often endure adverse childhood experiences such as exposure to violence, loss of a loved one, or homelessness, too often from birth, in early childhood, and beyond. Stress and trauma from these experiences impede healthy brain development, impacting the areas responsible for concentration, memory, and behavior. When it comes to school and learning, high concentrations of poverty-related stress have a significant impact not only on individual students, but also on the teachers and school leaders trying to serve them. Our goal this evening is to start a conversation about these issues. In that vein, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel, whose full biographies are included in your meeting materials. Gretchen Brion Meisels, lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who'll be facilitating the panel. Dreama Brown, vice president of the School Age Division at the Children's Aid Society in New York City. Yay. Gabriela Cassandra, social worker at Mott Haven Academy Charter School in the Bronx. Woo. And Stephanie Jones, associate professor in human development and urban education advancement at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And Darcy Lowell, founder and chief executive officer of Child First and located here in Bridgeport. We are honored by and grateful to this outstanding group of individuals for being with us today and sharing their experiences and perspectives. Please join me in welcoming our panel. And Gretchen, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I am very happy to be here. I'm also very loud. My background is as a middle school teacher, and I move around a lot. So I'm going to try with this mic and do the best I can, but I may move away from it slightly. Okay, we're going to get through this because we don't need it. So I consider myself a lifelong learner in a lot of different realms. And so what I'm going to do before the panel starts, because I do not consider myself an expert on this particular topic, is to try to frame for you a way of thinking about stress and trauma in schools that will help you to hear and integrate the information that the experts are going to give you, because the experts are sitting at that table over there. And this is a way of thinking about this work that comes out of several different bodies of research, some of which are psychological and some of which are sociological. So I want to start by setting the stage and asking us to think about schools and classrooms as ecosystems, or communities of living organisms that exist in relationship to the non-living components of their environments and act as a system. This is an idea that I learned from two scholars in San Francisco, Jeff Duncan Andrade and Sean Ginwright, who are two heroes of mine who come out of the world of sociology and education. So in every ecosystem, in every environment, for every organism, there are moments of stress. And as human beings, we face different types of stress. Some of that stress is normal, and we have normal, healthy reactions to it, so it challenges us to think and grow in new ways. And it might briefly increase our heart rate or stress hormone levels, but these things subside, and we figure out how to self-regulate relatively quickly. Other types of stress are more severe, but still manageable for us. So those are the types of stress that the Center for the Developing Child would call tolerable stress, often short-term, and can be managed with the resources that are available to us in our environment, either internally or through the things around us. Stress is referred to as toxic when it's strong, prolonged, and harmful to our body. And in these cases, its effects can literally be seen in our bodies and our brains. When stress is toxic, it can disrupt the development of our brains and the pathways that exist in our brains, and increase our chances of encountering disease, and also make it a lot harder for us to function in terms of executive functions, which is what we're going to talk about today. Toxic stress can be the result of one traumatic experience, something that's deeply disturbing, like witnessing community violence or engaging in war, but it can also be the result of an accumulation of distressing or disturbing experiences. And there is significant evidence, which Marla's just alluded to, that when children face recurrent experiences with cumulative stress and trauma over the course of their childhood, it can be detrimental to their cognitive, emotional, and even physical outcomes. So examples of those types of experiences are parental incarceration, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, parent substance abuse, mental illness. If you're interested in cumulative stress and the effects of cumulative adverse childhood experiences, I encourage you to check out the ACEs research because there's a lot of it, and it very clearly articulates how this is connected to health outcomes. We also often hear people talk about toxic stress as trauma. And when stress occurs recurrently, sometimes we talk about that as complex trauma. So trauma can affect our brain chemistry in a lot of ways that have to do with our learning, and make it more difficult for us to use our executive functioning skills. Executive functioning skills are things like being able to remember, pay attention, shift focus, self-regulate, organize our thoughts, and plan. I am not a brain scientist, so bear with me as I explain this. But here is the bottom line of this complicated picture, or somewhat complicated picture, that I think is really powerful and interesting. The bottom line is that we are human beings that have evolved over time to be able to deal with high levels of stress, in part by our bodies reacting such that our sensitivities are heightened, we are able to make decisions more quickly, and we can react in ways that keep us safe. And in instances of danger, for example, if a lion were coming down the street at you and you needed to run away, that would be really helpful. But when that heightened sense of fear or that heightened sense of stress occurs over and over and over again, what it does is it strengthens the part of our brain that reacts quickly. And when that part of our brain reacts quickly, the part of our brain that's in control of executive functions like planning, self-regulation, emotional regulation decreases. And so part of what happens, Part of what happens with toxic stress is that our ability to use executive functioning skills in our everyday life becomes more stressed. In other words, frequent experiences with traumatic stress or toxic stress or trauma challenge our executive functioning processes, and when this occurs, we're more likely to respond to situations with heightened emotions or to withdraw altogether. I want to point out that this experience is something that all of us have. Kids don't just do this because they're struggling or because something's wrong. We all do this. But there are many ways in which young people who exist in environments that have high levels of stress face this kind of challenge more regularly, on a regular basis. And Ginwright calls this persistent environmental trauma, which is the idea that in some environments there are high levels of stress very frequently. I want to also point out that the adults who live and work in environments with children who are experiencing persistent environmental trauma also often experience persistent stress, right? That can also be incredibly difficult. Because it's harder for all of us to use what we know to plan and monitor and access and make better judgments in conditions when we experience trauma and stress and strain. So going back to this idea of the ecosystem, we can think about schools and classrooms as ecosystems, and we can think about them as ecosystems that either support healing or ecosystems that contribute to the stress and trauma that young people face. And you can imagine that For some young people, for some adults, when they engage with young people who are experiencing persistent stress and trauma, they also start to experience persistent stress. Their own levels of anxiety and frustration go up. And this is really understandable, but depending on the self-regulatory skills of the adults in a room, schooling can become an experience of secondary trauma for young people. So when young people show up at school already feeling the effects of stress and trauma, and then they are exposed to adults who are feeling the experiences of stress and trauma and unable to self-regulate, experiences like being kicked out of class, being yelled at, being sent home can increase that stress. So our job really is to think about how classrooms and schools can be ecosystems that contribute to students' healing. And I wanted to share one more quick story from Jin Wright, who talks about a scientist that's a friend of his who was doing an experiment with plants. And the plants were exposed to high levels of toxin. And when they were alone in a room, the plants started to wilt and die. But when she put all the plants together in a room, what happened is that they were able to actually suck the toxins out of the air and heal each other. There was a way in which when the organisms worked together, they experienced healing. And that, I think, is a really nice metaphor for thinking about how classrooms can also be healing ecosystems. Now, the books that you got today, these 2 books on trauma-sensitive schools, are really guides around how we can start to create classrooms that are healing ecosystems, because trauma-sensitive schools are healing environments. They are places where young people are able to start to address the negative impacts of toxic stress. And the first book really, the purple book, really talks about why we need to do this work and makes the argument for why and starts to talk about how. And the second book really talks about how, the blue book. The work of social emotional learning is also really the work of creating healing environments. And so when we talk, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this because I feel like the grantees did a great job with this, but when we talk to schools about creating healing environments, we are talking about creating classrooms where social emotional learning happens and where both adults and children have the support that they need to self-regulate and engage with the learning material that's in front of them. We really stress the fact that children need opportunities to practice these SEL skills. So all of these things that you see are things that take time to learn. None of us can do them automatically, and none of us can do them 100% of the time. So opportunities to practice engaging our prefrontal cortex in environments that are calm and consistent are opportunities that help us move toward the kind of self-regulation we want to see in class. And when we talk to schools about this, I think Steph started to talk about this a little bit. We talk about this notion that building high-quality relationships is the base of a pyramid that supports classrooms as healing ecosystems. Daily routines and structures that support social-emotional learning become one more rung of that. Activities and lessons that directly teach social-emotional learning become one more rung of that. And then targeted scaffolding for students who are really struggling become the top of that pyramid. And again, I just want to highlight this notion that what's good for children is good for adults. So that anything that we do for the young people in our programs are things that we also want to be doing for teachers and other adults who are working in the programs with young people. So the bottom line, and then I'm going to hand it over to the panel, a few bottom lines. One is, it's really not about children coming to school with deficits. It's about the ways that stress impedes the deployment of executive functioning skills and makes it difficult for us to self-regulate and then engage in the kinds of behaviors that we'd like to see children engage in so that they can learn. It's a lot harder to use what you know, to plan, to monitor, to access your better judgment under conditions when you are frequently experiencing toxic stress. And that's true for everyone, not just children. Schools can either reinforce trauma or create new experiences of trauma when they don't provide children with opportunities to feel safe and valued and cared for. But in the positive, schools also have the potential to really begin to heal trauma when they provide opportunities for children to practice executive functioning skills and self-regulation in an environment that's predictable and caring, where there are strong relationships and where they have room to grow in safe ways. So with that framing, I am going to reintroduce our panel of thought partners, or experts, as I would like to call them. And I'm going to start by asking them each just to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about the work that they do related to toxic stress and trauma. So just thinking about the work that you do and how it relates to the sort of themes that have come up in this. Darcy, do you mind starting? Okay, I have to bring you this, sorry. I forgot. Thank you.
I take this, just this. Okay. First, I want to thank you all for having me here tonight. This is very, very exciting. Though my personal work is with very young children and families, knowing that this kind of work is going on in our schools and is so essential to continuing the really healthy trajectories that we're trying to establish is so fundamental, and it really makes me very excited, and hearing about everything people are talking about really is very thrilling to me. So my background, I am a developmental and behavioral pediatrician, and actually began Child First initially as a collaborative back in 1998 with an official start in 2001 as part of Bridgeport Hospital, because we were seeing children who were really suffering from trauma. They were being expelled from their preschool classrooms. They were had major behavioral and emotional problems, and we're talking about children under the age of 6. So we were seeing little ones. And when we looked more deeply, we saw that they had families who were really stressed and had multiple traumas in their own lives. So we're talking about moms who are depressed, substance abuse, domestic violence, homelessness. And instead of looking just at the child and saying, what is wrong with this child, or how can we correct what's happening with this child, we needed to take a different approach, exactly this ecological approach. We needed to say, what is happening here, not only for the child, but their primary relationships. So Child First is a relationship-based model. And it is, we feel, what happens in the parent-child relationship or the caregiver-child relationship, because it can be grandma, and it can be auntie, and it can be a foster parent, is so fundamental to brain development. And then it's looking at the challenges that our families experience that is so important in terms of decreasing the stress in the environment. So Child First began in Bridgeport. It is now in 15 sites throughout Connecticut and is one of the HRSA evidence-based models, and there are only about, I think, 14 of us nationally who are getting funded through the ACA, which is Obamacare, has funding that is available. So we have gone from our home in Bridgeport to really quite an opportunity to spread this model in a national focus. Our theory of change is exactly what Gretchen just explained. What we know is the stress and the trauma in the lives of young children is what causes actual damage to the developing brain. And we can't let that happen, but it happens very early on. By 8 months of age, we are going from 50 trillion neuronal connections, which is kind of like this, the connections between the nerves in your brain, to 1,000 trillion. And it's happening very fast. So we have an incredible opportunity to intervene when these children are very, very little. But how do we intervene? Well, one is obviously to decrease the stress in the environment. But I think there's something really important to talk about when it comes to toxic stress, and that is that it is not just the amount of stress, and this is something that Jack Shonkoff, who is at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, has said over and over, but it's in the absence of a nurturing caregiver. So what they have found out is that if you have a relationship with a caregiver that is powerful and secure and nurturing and the child feels safe, the damaging chemicals and hormones in the brain do not rise, and you can actually prevent the problems with the early foundation of brain development with that relationship. So that being said, Child First does two major things. Well, three major things. One, it has a care coordinator who connects families to services and supports in the community to decrease the level of stress. So all kinds of services, whatever the family needs. Then it has a mental health clinician who is an expert in early childhood, who actually works with a two-generation approach with both that parent and that child. And this is about the healing in the relationship. And at the same time, we're working on executive functioning with both the child and the adult. And the other piece that we have, which we feel is fundamental, is we have mental health consultation to early care and education, or kith and kin care, or wherever that child is cared for, because we know that is such a critical environment, and it is an incredible opportunity to develop other nurturing, protective relationships. So what we want to do in the classroom is help those teachers really understand what is that experience for that child, to stop and say, what does that behavior mean? Because all behavior has meaning. And to be thinking, instead of reacting, to be thinking about, how can I understand what that child is telling me? How can I understand their experience? How can I partner with their parent or caregiver to make a difference in their lives? And I'll give this on to the next person, but the last word here is, we have to take care of our teachers to make that happen. That if we don't nurture our teachers, and if we don't help them with their executive functioning, and not to be reactive and overwhelmed in the face of some very difficult behaviors, we're not going to allow them to really form those incredible, powerful relationships that can be such a unique opportunity.
The kids at school would be proud because I'm using my coping skills as I'm listening to Darcy, taking some deep breaths and regulating myself. My name is Gabriella. I'm a social worker at Haven Academy Charter School in the South Bronx. I've been in the Bronx for 10 years now, working with the child welfare population, 7 years at Mott Haven Academy. Mott Haven Academy Charter School was founded in 2008 as a K-1 school. We've expanded since then to be pre-K through 5th grade. We are now in our 8th year of operation. We are committed to serving a child welfare population with 1/3 of our scholars coming from foster care, either actively or while they're with us, their case is closed through adoption or return to parent. 1/3 of our kids are receiving preventative services to prevent foster care placement. And then 1/3 of our scholars come from the general community of the South Bronx. I don't know how many of you have read Random Family or heard Jonathan Kozol speak about the South Bronx, but it's one of the poorest congressional districts in the United States, Mott Haven especially. And Mott Haven Academy Charter School is located really prominently in amongst four major project departments. We have the Millbrook, Melrose, Patterson, and Brook Avenue projects, all within 10 blocks. So even our general community scholars come with their own toxic stress. You know, we know children in child welfare and in foster care have the stress of transitions, early interrupted attachment, but we can't stress enough how that third population that comes from general community constantly has the toxic stress of domestic violence, homelessness, poverty. And so we're really committed to helping each one of our scholars with this idea and this environmental model in mind. Can you hear me? Yeah. I really do not like mics. Okay. So who are our kids? I've given you the brief overview, but I think a lot about our scholars, and one of them comes particularly to my mind, and she was in her third stint in foster care, right? Her third time being placed in care after a major domestic violence incident at home, and she walked into school and she said, "How do you want me to learn?" She said, "I can't learn right now." She goes, "I have a huge pack of bubble gum in my hair and I can't get it out." We couldn't get her to read. She would love to read. She did not want to pick up a book. Could not focus in class. Her coping skills were, even though she had a foundation of some, it was very difficult for her to access them. Her executive functioning was affected. And here's this child in 3rd grade ready to take the state test, right? So what does Haven Academy do for her? And I guess, I don't know if this is a time to talk about it, if you want me to talk about it a little bit later. Okay. So for a child like her, we do a lot of different things. We kind of look, like Darcy is saying, at the entire environmental model, right? Where does mom come from? Mom was in foster care herself, right? Her grandmother was involved in the system. We now have 3 generations of intergenerational trauma and toxic stress that we have to work with to make sure that this third grader can learn. We work with the entire family. We teach in the classrooms. We have social work support and support systems, lots of small group instruction. But most importantly is we know the child, right? We know who she is. We know where she comes from. We understand what's making it hard for her to learn, and we build support systems around her to help support her and help her develop attachments to a significant adult in her family. So I use her as an example a lot, also because I love the bubblegum analogy, right? I think sometimes about going to school with this like pack of bubblegum and just all day wanting to get it out, right? And that to me is that toxic stress, and some days it was bigger than others, right? And so how that's, I mean, there's so much that we can do for our kids. That's great. Thank you. We're gonna come back and ask you more questions. Okay.
Good evening. My name is Dreama Brown. I'm currently the Vice President of the School Age Division at the Children's Aid Society. So I'm gonna go back a ways and kind of talk about how I ended up at the Children's Aid Society and what we do in the face of toxic stress and trauma. So I was a teacher, a high school and a middle school teacher. I actually taught in a district school in New Haven and then taught at the First Achievement First School, Amistad Academy, for its second and third years. And served as an instructional coach there as well. So it was nice to hear so many of the practices that the Achievement First team shared, because we used those like back then when I was in the classroom. And I saw how powerful those skills were for children when combined with, a really rigorous curriculum. And then after some time at Achievement First, I got an opportunity to train for the principalship in New York City. And so that took me to New York City. And in New York City, I did an internship at a pre-K through 8 school in Harlem that was actually kind of a community school, an early community school, in that the school had a school-based clinic that was run by Columbia Presbyterian. There were social workers, there was after-school programming and summer programming, as well as, the core instructional day. So that was a really powerful experience for me, because I could see what it looks like in a school when you intentionally structure in the supports to remove the barriers to learning and to address some of the known stressors that children come to school with, right? It's like sometimes in education we act like the children don't bring those things to school until it becomes a problem. Like, we know they're gonna come in the door, but yet we haven't changed the way our schools are structured to confront that head on. So I became really fascinated with how to make schools work better for children, especially children in high poverty communities. After that internship year, I was placed in a district school in the South Bronx. It was a very distressed school. Would be described as a turnaround school. It was an elementary school. My first days, that particular school had 5 different principals in a year. I had 14-year-old fourth graders, so imagine children held over in kindergarten, first grade, second grade. First day of state testing, there was a fight in the classroom, so shocker, they didn't do well on the test, right? And it was pretty clear that the morale was low. People were very stressed out. First day of school, I had 3 parents show up drunk and or high to bring their child to school. Had a parent take a swing at me. Very distressed school. And what I found to be most compelling from that experience was when I had the adults define their reality, like just speak to it and say, this is what's happening, and come to some agreements about how we wanted things to be. There was a lot of progress made in a very short amount of time. So we literally took reach and defined it for ourselves. So the staff, we came to agreement about what respect meant for us based on the children in front of us, the parents in front of us. And that work took a couple of years till it got to the place where the children use that language, right? You know you're in the right place when, you know, a child comes to the principal's office because they've gotten into some trouble. And, you know, early on, the children would say, I'd say, well, why are you here? And they'd say, because I was being bad. But what does that mean? Well, 2 years later, it means things like, I wasn't showing respect. Okay, tell me more. What does that mean? Well, I wasn't keeping my hands to myself. I did this, I did that. And that was a result of the adults coming together to define what respect looked like. So, so we did some of the same things that I heard others talking about tonight. Like we had monthly, we had books of the month that focused on each of the values. We had activities, we had celebrations. And pretty quickly, we could feel a shift in the tone of the school. But the critical mistake I made as a principal at that point, because I was so focused on moving the needle on academic achievement, was that I thought that good teaching alone and some values would do it. And while the school, you know, showed great academic growth, the children showed great academic growth, over the long haul, 3 years ago, the school went back into phase out. And so the community itself hadn't been able to hold that school because there were so many needs that persisted in that particular community, which was very isolated. And so that was a real critical lesson for me about the importance of addressing those stressors in the structure of the school, and giving people the capacity to identify when we're operating under circumstances affected, influenced by trauma and or that toxic stress. So that's what brought me to the Children's Aid Society. Children's Aid Society is 162 years old. They basically invented foster care with the orphan trains in New York. And so the agency has a very strong commitment to children in foster care, who we would understand have experienced a great amount of trauma in the separation from a birth parent and any of the circumstances that led to that separation. And so in our work in the school age division, which is a division I supervise, we partner with 18 schools, 17 district schools, and we launched Children's Aid College Prep Charter School 4 years ago to try to rethink school organization for children living in high poverty communities. In New York City, 1 in 3 children live in poverty. The communities that we're in, and we've heard a lot about the effects of poverty on brain development and the stress that comes with living in poverty. So our work, we focus in 4 neighborhoods in New York: Washington Heights, the North Shore, Staten Island, the South Bronx, Harlem, East Harlem. So I spend a lot of time in a lot of different schools in those communities helping to put a range of supports in place to do what we describe as creating the conditions for learning while removing the barriers to learning. So I am convinced that unless schools organize themselves to address toxic stress as it presents to the population in front of you, we will never, ever reach our full potential as organizations. And our system will never, ever reach its full potential. And so we'll talk about that more in a lot of different ways. But I'll probably talk more specifically about our work at Children's Aid College Prep. But in our division, we serve about 10,000 children every day through those schools, 300 of which are at Children's Aid College Prep Charter School, where we're trying to do some things differently to address the reality. How it shows up for us, and I'll end here and I'll pass it on, is, we see things like, let's say, for example, in New York City, where the cost of housing, rent is so high, we see multiple families living in the same apartment, multiple families. And, all in the same family, technically, but, sort of second cousins, aunts and uncles twice removed. And we've seen an uptick in molestation cases because you have these very tenuous familial relationships and you have children in those environments. Those kinds of things create a lot of stress. Those circumstances create a lot of stress. We give out a lot of aid through the New York Times Neediest Fund. We give out $1 million a year in all sorts of assistance, everything from rental assistance when a family's facing eviction. That is a stressor on a family. But we actually spend the most on something that I found surprising, which was helping people keep the lights on. That, we spend a lot of money on that, getting lights turned back on. So it is poverty, it evolves, it shifts, it changes, it looks so many ways, but we know that it shows up in our schools based on the behaviors, based on the lower than expected performance of children that we know could perform well in school.
I feel like you've heard enough from me, but I was, okay. You can do that. We work together a lot. So I'll just say three things. The way we do our work is by going around and telling the story that Gretchen just told you. And so we talk about the science of toxic stress and its impact on children and adults. And not everybody knows this story, and it's a pretty interesting and compelling story when you hear it this way. So we go around and we talk about this a great deal. We also develop, as you know, as you've heard, tools that can be used in different places that provide supports for adults and children to build skills that offset some of these challenges. And we began with an intervention, a curriculum focused on social emotional learning with executive function and self-regulation at its core. We've been implementing it at Children's Aid College Prep for 4 years. And we learned a couple of things over time in doing that work. One was that we needed to really support adults at the same time, focused on the very same issues. So not just adult social and emotional skills, but adult executive function, self-regulation, and toxic stress. And that we were hearing from teachers and parents really the same thing, the same kinds of stressors, the same exact stressors. So stress is one, access to resources, and children's behavior problems. Both groups say the same thing. So we thought, we should develop a set of tools and resources and supports for adult groups that align with the kinds of practices that are designed to support children, so that children are nested in a set of environments where the same language is being used and the same tools could be used. And we actually did a lot of that work in partnership with these two ladies right here, so and maybe with Darcy too in the future. So that's all.
That's great. That does answer my question.
Great.
So we're in the same place, which is just, and I'm going to now invite the three of you to sort of add to it, which is, I'm going to skip over the challenges because of time, and I really want to focus on what you've seen that's worked. So thinking about what are the ways that you have seen parents or teachers or schools and organizations best support children who are facing high levels of stress and trauma. Go ahead. Oh, you can start, Gabrielle.
Okay. If at the back of the handouts that you had, you should have something with the Haven Academy logo. It looks like this, a 3-tiered chart. If you could just pull that out, because I want to reference a few of these points as we talk about some of the best practices and some of the practices that we use at Haven. And I say that with a disclaimer that there is so much more work to be done, and learning from Stephanie and Dreama and Darcy and all of you will help us kind of refine this. I also want to just say that this is a product of 8 years work of reflection, understanding, examining our practices, thinking about our practices, coming together every summer and thinking about what we could do better in the upcoming year. So this is 8 years worth of kind of looking at what we do from a SEL lens, and it's, again, something that we will keep on working on. So if you look at kind of the way we break it down in thinking about what we put in place to address toxic stress, so tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 interventions. Just follow along with me, and if you have any questions, jot them down. We can answer at the end. But you think about second step. So second step is our social emotional curriculum that we teach in each one of the grades, pre-K through 5th grade. So our kids come to us at 3, and they already have about an hour a week of social emotional learning in their classrooms, and it's taught by the social worker. So second step is taught by our social worker and then supported by our teachers, which is interesting because the teachers feel like there's a loop, right? If they feel supported, it kind of eliminates any problems. It increases communication between the social worker and the teacher. And then it gives the social worker an opportunity to be in the classrooms every week and watch the dynamic of the classroom and observe. That being said, we usually use second step, but then when we look at our data, we do DESA data every year, and we look at our data. If it seems like a classroom needs more help in a particular area, that second step might not address as thoroughly as we need them to. Like executive functioning, we'll take resources from other materials like zones of regulation, which really helps kind of identify emotions, develop self-regulation skills, identify triggers. So we say second step is really our social emotional curriculum, but we do adapt it depending on the classroom needs. PBIS, so positive behavior support, we implemented it 4 years ago because we saw a very high number of aggressive behaviors, and we felt that creating school-wide expectations and scholars really knowing what was expected from them across all areas of the school building was going to be so important in setting that tone and setting that culture. And after our first year of PBIS, we really saw a decrease in the amount of aggressive behaviors, and especially a decrease in the aggressive behaviors amongst our child welfare population, where the highest number really came from them that year. Responsive classroom strategies, for those of you who are familiar with responsive classroom, one of them I want to highlight is kind of the use of a positive, supportive take a break, where taking a break is really used to self-regulate as opposed to a consequence for a misbehavior, right, on the carpet. It's used as an opportunity to self-regulate. And in most of our classrooms, you'll see coping skills next to the take a break chair, so that the scholars go to take a break and they have that visual right there. This is what I'm supposed to do when I'm in take a break. I'm supposed to belly breathe. I'm supposed to count to 10. I'm supposed to use self-talk. And as a reminder, a visual reminder for them to be able to regulate themselves, to go back to learn. We talked, I spoke a little bit before about the family work we do. We're constantly engaging our families, communicating with our families, really understanding where they come from. Also, really engaging the social work agencies and the case planners around the work that we do. For me as a social worker, it's always very important to understand when a child goes on a home visit, when the home visit doesn't happen. It's important for me to understand when reunification is coming up, when there's a talk about the child going back to the birth parent. So then, as a social worker, I can engage the birth parent, come to Haven, meet me, see the classroom, commit to having your child stay here, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to be in your child's best interest, that consistency and stability of education. And so that communication with the case planning agencies and the social welfare, the child welfare agencies end up being a big part of what we do. In the tier 2, looking at the BEARS curriculum, we implemented that last year to address this issue of attachment. Many of our children come to us with disorganized attachment and difficulty connecting to adults because of interrupted attachment at a very young age. So the BEARS curriculum that was written by Leslie Kaplow from Bank Street, what it does is each child in pre-K and K get their own bear. And they are taught to sit safely and comfortably with the bear. And they get to name their bear and give their bear an age and a personality. And the bears come out during rest time. They come out during certain read-alouds, if the read-alouds are of a sensitive nature, like a discussion of family, right? The scholar sits with the bear on their lap while we're reading a book about what different families may look like. And it really helps them kind of attach and identify their feelings. One of the girls today in pre-K said, "My bear is 80 years old and her name is Anthony." And the teacher and I were like, okay. But it's really interesting to see kind of the personalities that develop and the attachment that's formed with the bear, and hopefully then that bear acts as a transitional object to attaching to the teacher. So that was something that we did 2 years ago. In tier 3, kind of thinking about our mandated counseling, our preventative counseling, this year so far, by November, 67 of our scholars are receiving counseling. I think 23 of those cases are mandated, the rest are all preventative. So that looked like retention counseling for scholars who were retained, check-in counseling, check-in, check-out, where there's a check-in at the beginning of the day, a check-out at the end to make sure that our kids, our scholars, really are staying connected to an adult and have an opportunity to express themselves. We do that through our staffing system. We have 2 social workers, but we also have 4 interns. We develop partnerships with the local schools of social work, and usually have about 4 to 5. 5 is a lot, I'll be honest with you, for one person to handle. So 4 seems like a manageable number for one person to supervise, and those interns are key to providing preventative counseling and some family work. Another thing, and I'm almost done, I promise, but in Tier 3, our behavioral problem-solving tools, I have a copy of it if anybody wants to see it at the end, but what we did is we took the second step principle of STEP, which is problem solving, right? You say the problem, you think of solutions, you explore consequences, you pick the best solution, and we incorporate it into a daily tool that scholars use when they need to solve a problem. So to be able to decrease the severity of a behavior, if the child needs to be removed from the classroom, here's your problem-solving tool, go ahead. And it follows the same sequence of steps that we teach in second step, right? So the kids are all familiar with it. They fill out this tool, they pick their best solution, they explore the consequences, and then they are reintegrated back into class. It's interesting for our data collection, because then we can kind of see trends in scholars leaving the room to problem solve, but then it is also really interesting in the fact that it's school-wide, right? And it's aligned with our second step. Lastly, we've done a lot of work this year around attendance. About 37 of our families last year had 15 or more absences by the end of the school year. And so we realized there was really a lot to be done around targeting chronic absenteeism, because 2 things happen. When our kids are not in school, they don't learn. And then when our kids are not in school, they're exposed to even more toxic stress. One of our kids didn't come to school the other day because she was in a deli where there was a shooting, right? 2 guys got shot in front of her. So she was afraid to leave the house the next day, so she didn't leave the house, right? So this child is missing school and at home terrified to leave the house and think about what is happening to her brain with this trauma and this exposure. So we had to get this idea of the chronic absenteeism under control. So we've rolled out a lot of positive attendance, right? Shout outs, get on the speaker, give spirit tickets, give awards, dress down days, dress up days, right? We've done a lot of that positive stuff. But for our families who really experience a lot of the chronic absenteeism, for many of the reasons Dreama spoke about, we've paired them with an attendance coach. So one of the staff members from our schools will say, I will support Jessica's family, and I will be their coach, right? Reaching out to them personally, providing them with incentives, getting to know the family, getting to know the kids, encouraging them to come to school, and trying to really figure out the barriers to this chronic absentee problem. And I'm super interested to find out kind of by the end of the year to look at our data, because our numbers are already showing a really great improvement in the absentee rate for those 16 families we paired with coaches. The other ones were a little bit more complicated, so I've been doing a lot of that work, but I want to focus on the 16 families that have been getting the coaching. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm aware that we have about 5-ish minutes, and then we probably need to wrap up. Right? Okay, but I'm hoping that maybe one of the other 3 panelists, if you want to also contribute other ideas and things you've seen and add to that, that would be great.
Okay, I could do some of that. So I'm going to just take a little bit of a different perspective, because I am so concerned about very young children. So if I said something that worked, that I thought was essential, I would say start earlier. Start when they're little, because by the time they get to school, there has been a tremendous amount going on in those little brains. And the kind of trauma that we are seeing in very young children, the kind of stress, is really preventing the kind of healthy development which is the foundation of all future learning. Not just the foundation of social emotional development and mental health, but learning, cognitive development, language, and executive functioning. And we know how critical that is for them to be able to get into school and to be regulated and to be able to learn. And I think sometimes there are mistakes, not just in terms of not starting early enough with the children, but not really understanding enough what's happening to their parents. In Child First, and we're a home-based model, by the way, I don't know if I said that, but we have 98% of our parents are exposed to significant trauma in their lives. And when a parent is exposed to that trauma, they get triggered and dysregulated. And so they do not necessarily benefit from many of the opportunities for parenting interventions, a parenting program, et cetera, because they're not using their prefrontal cortex, which is the site of executive functioning, as Gretchen told us, to be able to take in information and to learn because they are not self-regulated themselves. All right? So I think that for those families who are have the most difficult life circumstances and the greatest challenges, we've got to think a little bit differently. We've got to start by saying the home is critical. We can do fantastic things in school, but if we don't pay attention to what's happening in those home environments, those little children are going to continue to come into school and to be dysregulated. They are going to be triggered by any number of things that happen because maybe they've seen so much abuse in their own homes. Maybe they've seen dad beat up mom and they can't concentrate and they're running around the room. And then what happens? Their teacher yells at them to sit down. And when the child doesn't want to do that, they get sent to the principal. And what happens then? They are just, what it communicates is there is no safe place for me. No one can help me. And they are totally out of control and unable to learn. So we need a partnership between what's happening in the home, and we've got to pay attention to that, as well as what's happening in the school. Because I believe that all of these great, wonderful things that these people, that all of you are doing, is necessary, but it's not sufficient if we don't pay attention to those early environments and those relationships. Because those relationships, if you look at the resilience literature, it's all about relationships. Children can grow up in very difficult circumstances. If they have someone who cares about them and loves them, if they feel safe and secure inside, they have the ability to transcend those circumstances. And so I think that I would say that we've got to pay attention to both of these environments, that it is so very critical, and that together, with a partnership, we can really do fantastic things. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I will just build on your point about relationships and the critical connections. I mean, I think if we've learned nothing else, it's how siloed we are in schools and how we don't leverage everyone's roles in the greatest possible ways. So, you know, for us, for example, you know, we have decided to invest in school social workers because of the population we serve. We have a preference for child welfare involved kids, single parent, kids from single parent homes, from that community we live in the Bronx. So for us, we have to confront those things, and we have chosen to have our life coaches, we don't call them social workers because some kids have had a bad experience with a social worker. Our life coaches teach life skills classes, co-teach them now. We started out having them teach them alone, and then we decided it made better sense to have the classroom teacher and life coach co-teach life skills once a week together. And that has made a tremendous difference. We put those structures that we learned from the secure team into the classroom. So the children have a secure spot in the classroom where they can go and self-regulate, and they have all sorts of tools in there to do that, a timer, a feather, things to hold on to. And in some instances, those social workers become support to the family. We have instances where, you know, particularly, you know, we had one incident where there was some severe domestic violence, like the father wasn't in the home, but he was calling and he was saying very scary things. And our life coach went to the home, did a session with the family in the home, minus the father, and set up a secure spot in the home, where, you know, they have a feelings tree so the children can name how they're feeling, a thermometer, the journal, and all the tools that they have in the school. And that was tremendous for all of the children in that family. The mother and the connection to the school day was very palpable and powerful for that family. But we invest in that, and I think schools under-invest in that. No, the principal cannot do it. No, the teachers cannot do it alone. It has to be an investment because we know the issues present. So we have to do that work. There's no shortcut around it. Those are relationships that are built over time. It's knowledge of families that make the difference. And the last thing I'll say related to this is that, you know, I've coached a lot of principals in my day, also in other work that I've done. And the principal really is the embodiment of the values of the school. And so what we've talked about today in terms of the adults having to be powerful models of these skills, it's really important. If the principal's not self-regulating, the teachers aren't, and the teachers aren't going to be able to model those for the children. So if you want to see some major undermining going on of that work, then you watch the adults stomping around that building, blowing up at each other. We are incredible hypocrites to the children when we do that. It's so undermining, you may as well not even bother. And it's a simple fact. It's a simple fact. They watch us, and they learn from what we do. And so, you know, we've made staffing changes based on that. Like, you cannot self-regulate at all, ever. So how on earth can you model that for children? We create space between teachers and life coaches so the teachers benefit from that skill set, that therapeutic skill set. They get to talk about their stress, and then we have structures in place. So sometimes the principal is causing stress, right? And so the principal has to be able to hear that feedback and know that their job is different now in a school where the expectation is that we're helping create these healthy social-emotional environments for children.
Thank you all so much. Because of time, I'm going to hand it back over, but I think, go ahead.
No, I would just say that to just emphasize how much the support for the teacher is necessary so that the teachers, because our teachers get also triggered. They get things, they get overwhelmed, and if we don't pay attention to that, they can't be with their children in a way that's going to be growth promoting. So I think that, you know, to be able to give them that space and that it takes time and that we can't underestimate that. Just one thing, I do have some just information, one-page information on Child First if you're interested, so I'll just leave it out here.
Thank you so much.